Right, and is it desirable to bring as much of the OTC trades, onto the exchanges? Or?
Well, I believe there needs to be an infrastructure to have transparency. Pre-trade transparency and certainly post-trade transparency.
Right.
Now, how those mechanisms will emerge will depend. I understand there's some work being done in Europe and some being done in the United States. And the question of whether they will become into the commercial remit of the current regulated exchanges or some other structures, I think, is still an open.
Why did the IOSCO give itself the mandate of dealing with this thing about outsourcing as being an important assignment that you're working on at the moment? The principles of outsourcing, you seem to have done a lot of work in that area.
We have done some work in that area. It's really a matter of controls and making sure that there are not risks involved in excessive risks involved.
But in terms of all the
outsourcing.
priorities that you have, why did you give yourself that as being one?
Well, I think that's one of many priorities. It's not necessarily been our main priority.
Okay.
And I think you'll see that IOSCO's had a number of work streams that it's had on foot. And if you look at our main priority, I think you would say it's been one which has been greatly successful. And that is to ensure that we have the infrastructure of enforcement information exchange around the world. In 2005, we set ourselves the objective that every country in IOSCO, which is 109 jurisdictions and over 95% of the world's capital markets, would have signed on to a special agreement that allowed the securities markets regulators to talk to each other seamlessly, carving out banking secrecy in some countries, changing the law in others. And we're going to achieve that by 2010. Now, that's a global idea made local in every jurisdiction around the world, and it provides an infrastructure which, frankly, if we didn't have it, the sort of dealing that we have to do in the crisis would be almost impossible. So that's been one of our major priorities.
Right, and where would the role of alternative trading systems and the Bloombergs, the Reuters of the world, where does that fit into this this mechanism of market making, of information providing and all that?
Well, we haven't actually focused on those entities. They have not created an issue or a problem that we can see. We're much more focused at the moment on the unregulated parts of the market where the mischief occurred that caused the crisis. And I think that's where our priorities have to be. So we're looking, for example, at cross-border supervision, entities that have work in every number of countries. How do we make sure that they get equal treatment, that we understand what's happening in each of those countries? So that's one major part. Another major direction is this question of boundary of supervision. What should be supervised and what shouldn't? I heard Professor Klugman today say anything that needs to be rescued needs to be regulated. That's one test. It's not the only test, though, because there may be out there entities or products which are likely to become systemically damaging to the financial system, and we need to be able to see those products, recognise that they need regulation, and then regulate them.
Well, then do you see the IOSCO being powerful enough to create some kind of uniformity in this entity called the Securities Commission? It means different things in some different countries.
It does, but what I do see is, firstly, IOSCO becoming much more operational. So we're going to get much more into the business of the business. Just as we've now put up standards for credit rating agencies and hedge funds, we are looking at actual entities that are performing in the markets and setting standards for regulation of those. We will increase this activity. And as we do that, we're going to have to engage with industry much more. And so we are now looking at ways in which we can have a much better dialogue with industry.
Securities commissions as an animal in itself, as an entity in itself, in all of the different countries, and especially in New Zealand where you come from, what is the work being done to regulate the broker-dealer community, and what is the extent of your responsibility towards the consumer? I see that you're getting more and more downstream, and you're getting more and more into the face of the final purchaser of securities in that sense. So what's happening on that front?
Well, I think that question of investor protection is a vital one. And increasingly around the world, it has really two elements. One is the regulation of the products and markets themselves, and the other is investor education, trying to ensure that people buying financial products understand what they're buying, understand the risks they're taking. So they're the two main thrusts.
Right. In Australia, they moved the investor, a Financial Literacy Council to the Securities Commission. Do you see a need that that having a separate entity responsible for consumer protection that covers all of the different financial assets is a better arrangement than having something sit under the SC, for example?
I think both models can work, but the most important thing is that there is political will and funding created to enable this to happen, because otherwise it's almost impossible for commissions which have competing priorities to give the focus to investor education.
Right. This financial crisis advisory group that you sit in, together with the IFRS and the FASB, one of the interesting dynamics taking place in the aftermath of the global crisis is the influence of the Americans versus the, well, you would say the continental approach to accounting rules, and even in terms of regulation. How do you see that dynamics working through? And do you see the US model coming through, influencing how the rest of the world would look at accounting standards going forward? Or is there a lot of dialogue and
There's a huge amount of dialogue. The Financial Crisis Advisory Group was actually formed in order to try and bring together some principles in relation to that. It's just published its report and it sets out those principles. And one of them is that we do need one set of accounting standards around the world. That's absolutely clear.
Right.
Now, how we get there is going to be quite
Well, Americans were never fond of mark-to-market. They were never fond of Basel II, and there's a whole range of things that quite obviously that they would prefer not to have.
Well, they've just announced a draft that brings mark-to-market fully into play. So I'm not sure I agree with you. I think that that certainly in those discussions we have seen a great deal of willingness to cooperate and a real effort to try and bring together, particularly in relation to financial instruments, which is a critical accounting standard that needs to be addressed. And everyone, both the IASB and the FASB, both understand that that's an accounting standard that must be addressed very quickly, and they're both working towards it. I think what we have seen is a little debate between prudential regulators and conduct regulators, and I guess the point I would make is financial stability is a critical remit of both. Both sets of regulators are really working to exactly the same end, and we need to get them in alignment.
Right.